Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's meeting on leadership in the time of war. The topic is serious and important. It's important because it's been more than or almost a year and a half since the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Actually, the newest wave of the Russian aggression, because the war didn't start in February 2022. And since the war is ongoing, the discussions are ongoing. And hopefully there will be actions taken based on the best discussions, and the conflict will be transformed. But we would like to take part in this process, conflict transformation. And this is why we are meeting today with our great panelists. This webinar is organized as a part of the Youth Solidarity Project, led by the Ukrainian Leadership Academy, Romanian PATRIR, Italian un Ponte and myself. And we are privileged that we have three distinguished guests today with us. Let me introduce the panelists. First, Joanna Weschler, former Deputy Executive Director and Head of Research at the Security Council Report, independent writer, lecturer. In the past, she worked for the Human Rights Watch in different capacities, including 11 years as Human Rights Watch UN representative in New York and Geneva. Joanna, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Yuri Manilov is our representative, is the representative of the Ukrainian Leadership Academy, where he works as a project manager, working on developing leadership skills among Ukrainian youth. He worked in Mariupol before the war. Besides working in the field of non-formal education, he also leads an organization supporting armed forces in Ukraine. Yuri, thank you very much for joining us. And last but not least, Katarzyna A, who leads the Responsible Leadership Academy. But until 2021, she served as the first deputy and then acting director of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Before joining the OSCE, so one of the biggest organizations on our continent, including countries not only from our continent, she was a director of Save the Children child protection programs based in Georgia. She also got some wonderful, amazing awards, including the Peace International Award of Excellence. Katarzyna, welcome to the webinar. That sounds amazing, right? When I'm, talking about how amazing the panelists are, my thoughts are, oh my gosh, the discussions will be gorgeous. Hopefully I have good enough questions for such excellent panelists. But we have hour and a half, and we'll spend 1 hour talking about the basic concepts. I will be asking questions, the panelists will be answering them. They will try to analyze what true leadership is, what kind of leaders are needed in the time of war, in the time of crisis, and what role different actors at different levels can play in transforming conflicts. Then at the end, we will have time for questions from the audience. Be free to write your questions in the chat anytime you want. It can be after someone's speech answer. So throughout the webinar, you can post your questions in the chat. And at the end of the webinar, we will try to answer those questions. Of course, I have my own list of additional questions if no one else has any questions, so no worries. There will be some tough questions at the end as well. I would like to, at the beginning, start with talking about the past and the present, and then we'll move to the future. And also at the beginning, I want to start with the big picture. the international, the global picture or global level. And when we think about international level and leadership, what comes to mind is the United Nations. And since we have Joanna, one of the best experts on the UN, I know, I will start with you. For the UN, it was a really tough situation, mainly because of the fact that the main aggressor in the war was and is one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So how do you assess the response of the UN and the UN Security Council after the Russian invasion? Did we have true leaders in this institution? Joanna.
Well, you already mentioned the biggest problem in this whole landscape, which is the UN, that Russia is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Security Council is the most powerful political body in the UN, and permanent members, among other things, can veto almost any decision that the Council is trying to adopt, and they are that permanent member is unhappy with the decision. So that was already there when the invasion started. So the Council, there was at least a scene from New York and through the lens of the Council, increasingly alarming news was coming in about Ukraine. So the Council started meeting fairly frequently on Ukraine already in late January, and then held several debates in February. And then on the 23rd for us, it was close to midnight already in Moscow, I was having coffee with a Security Council diplomat, and he suddenly looked at his phone and showed me his phone, and it was a letter from the ambassador of Ukraine calling for an urgent evening session of the Security Council. So our coffee meeting ended very quickly because the diplomat had to go back. And it was really sort of an unreal situation because Russia had the presidency of the Security Council. That's kind of automatic, but it added an additional layer of irreality to the whole situation, and members started talking about the threat and expressing their very serious concerns. And Ambassador Nebenzia, the Russian permanent representative at the UN, was the traffic director of all the interventions. And at some point, the news came, and most people have it on their phones, that the bombing of Kiev started. So it was a really kind of very dramatic, but also quite unreal moment. And the Council met, I think the next day there was an attempt, or maybe 2 days later, there was an attempt to adopt a resolution condemning the invasion and calling for Russia to withdraw its troops. Obviously, the Russians vetoed this resolution, which is actually, this alone shown that the permanent members are very problematic as a whole, because there is a provision in the UN Charter in Article 27.2 that if there is a resolution being adopted by the Security Council on a conflict in which one of the members of the Council is involved, that members should abstain. And this is something that none of the permanent members ever brings up. And I actually asked at some point, that was a while ago, that was in 2014 in the context of the Crimea veto by Russia. Two permanent members, Western permanent members, separately told me, we have a gentleman's agreement not to bring it up because each of us may need, it's just a question of convenience and not being put in an uncomfortable situation if they want to be part of something they are involved in. So then 2 days later, it was already Sunday, there was a resolution adopted under an interesting procedure, which is called Uniting for Peace. And it is a procedure under which Security Council can ask the General Assembly to take on an issue if Security Council is blocked by the veto. And this was an interesting moment because, for instance, nobody wanted to use this procedure in 2014 when Russia invaded parts of Ukraine and there was almost no reaction. But this time there was a resolution presented, and this is when something like this happens, the resolution is considered procedural, and in procedural resolutions, the veto doesn't function, doesn't apply. You have to have 9 votes in favor and the resolution is adopted. So it was adopted, and in a few days later, the General Assembly adopted practically the same resolution the Security Council was trying to adopt, and was a big majority. It was overwhelmingly adopted. So Russia saw how much it was disapproved of. So that was quite useful.
So can we say that the General Assembly showed true leadership in the time of crisis when the UN Security Council was unable to act? And we talked lately about the actors. Can you talk a bit more? Who were the leaders? What countries were really active? Maybe surprisingly, not the biggest ones, but the smaller ones when the invasion started?
Well, the General Assembly actually has been giving signs of political life for a few years now, because even though the invasion of Ukraine has been the most dramatic way of showing helplessness of the Security Council, and it is a really appalling example because it leaves one of the permanent members completely impune. So it is very, very embarrassing for the Security Council. But General Assembly has been doing things in the last few years where they come without an invitation, and sometimes even without waiting for the Security Council, because it's not true that the General Assembly cannot touch anything that the Council is involved with. So we had, for instance, I think the first big example was creation of an office to collect documentation and evidence of war crimes committed in Syria after there were countless vetoes on anything Syria related. And in this case, it was the lead took 2 ambassadors from very small countries. One was the ambassador of Liechtenstein. We know it's not a powerful actor. And the other one was female ambassador of Qatar. And it was really brilliant work, and it took about a year, but the office, which it's essentially like a prosecutorial office. So it prepares materials for possible prosecution, when prosecution will be possible in the future. So I'm jumping into the future, but it isn't without importance. In terms of Ukraine, what happened is that if this procedure Uniting for Peace is used, the General Assembly declares holding of a special session, and special session doesn't, it's ongoing, it's open-ended until there is a resolution to close this special session. And because of that, the General Assembly can be meeting very quickly, and it has met initially for the with the condemnation of the invasion, but also soon after adopted a resolution on the humanitarian situation, which couldn't be adopted in the Council. Then adopted a resolution excluding Ukraine from the Human Rights Council, declared the referenda invalid. So it's not just symbolic words. Some of it is actually quite useful, and definitely Russia feels both the disapproval and also isolation. But when I look at, I don't want to go too far away from Ukraine, but when looking at the General Assembly and the signs of life and doing things that the Council is unable to do because of the veto, indeed, there are a lot of examples of leadership on the part of really small countries. So Liechtenstein is probably the most active on anything related to accountability, on justice, human rights, veto, but other countries that have been very active as, for instance, Luxembourg, Costa Rica, Marshall Islands. There is a, for instance, there is a, it's still ongoing, but there is an initiative which kind of started at the General Assembly to create a special tribunal on the crime of aggression in Ukraine. And this is something in which Poland is quite active. And I think there was, in June, there was even a meeting of interested parties in Warsaw. But you really don't get a sense that you have to be a powerful big country to have an impact. One of the very impactful, for instance, countries is Singapore. There was a debate which was during the Russian presidency a few months ago this year, and it was supposedly the biggest event that Russia held during its presidency, and Lavrov came to chair it, which is very unusual. And it was about defending the security, the UN Charter and multilateralism. So it was kind of absurd and ironic for Russia to be calling a debate on this topic. And a lot of speakers, it was an open debate, so everybody who wanted to speak could speak, but a lot of speakers kind of talked about general things without even mentioning the word Ukraine. And the Singaporean ambassador started out by saying we cannot avoid the elephant in the room, and then proceeded talking about how unacceptable the invasion was, and was really very, very powerful. So you can have the strongest statement from the smallest country.
This is why I ask these questions, because often when we think about such situations as invasion or war, we immediately look at the biggest, we believe, most powerful actors. But in fact, there are often actors less visible, but sometimes more active and doing amazing things. Joanna, thank you very much, because what you started, I want to continue this topic with Yuri, because you are not only representing the Ukrainian Leadership Academy, you are from Ukraine, and you were in Ukraine when the war started. It was a huge test for the Ukrainian leadership when the Russian aggression started. But again, when we think about leadership and Ukraine, what comes to mind is the Ukrainian president as the leader of the country, taking lead, etc. But what we often forget about is that a lot is happening on the ground at the grassroots level. So from your perspective, how do you assess the leaders at the political level and the grassroots level when you compare them? And what do you think that a change in Ukraine is also actually happening from below? We see nonviolent resistance in many cities. We see civilians, young people showing resistance to Russia, to the Russian soldiers, to the occupation, etc. So did the leaders emerge at the grassroots level, and how it looks on the ground? What is happening? Do we have leaders on the ground? What are the organizations that are active in Ukraine, and who are the real leaders in Ukraine right now? I know a lot of questions, but I hope that you can, grasp what I mean, because you are representing the Ukrainian Leadership Academy. So you focus on leadership, you work with people on the ground. So your expertise would be a great value here.
Yeah, thank you so much for these wonderful questions. I will do my best to make comments on every single question that you asked. So first of all, speaking about the national leadership, about President Zelensky, I have to admit that at the beginning, before the war, me personally had a lot of doubts regarding this presidency and his candidacy, and honestly, I didn't vote for him. But when the war broke out, I found out that basically he has a very important traits that make him a very successful president during the war. Basically, his background as being a showman was one of the reasons of my skepticism at the beginning. But in terms of a war, there is a huge demand for creating senses, for provoking emotional reactions, for uniting people. And basically his expertise and his background in being a showman and working on television probably is making out of him the best possible candidate for the presidency during the war. And he truly became the national leader. And I would say that his work that he's doing is amazing. Basically, from the point of view of Ukrainian people, it is always not enough for doing something, but still we have to admit that our government right now is doing the great job. One of the most probably powerful things that they done is that they transformed the Ukrainian perception of power. We have culturally conditioned mistrust to the power, because we had a lot of historical circumstances where power, like an actual authority, was far from Ukraine. So whether it was in Moscow or in Vienna, etc., Ukraine always was like a part of a bigger state, and where the capital city and the authority were somehow alienish, or not from Ukrainian origin. And that's why we have a very big culturally conditioned mistrust to the authority. And we kept this mistrust since the independence of Ukraine since 1991. And it's kept still like being like in Ukrainian minds until the war broke out, because what President Zelensky did, he changed the perception of Ukrainian people. And right now I could say that Ukraine feels much like as united as it never have been. We trust our government, we trust each other, and we feel this unity and a demand for action. I would say that this is not only the President Zelensky who is like a main cause of Ukrainian resistance, because it is also really, really dependent on the grassroots initiatives and on the Ukrainian people itself. I would say that it is like a great combination of the Ukrainian national spirit and the expertise and the will of our political leadership. And like in Ukraine, we are basically don't perceive ourselves as like leading by somebody. So when we are saying that the President Zelensky is our leader, it doesn't mean that he leads us to somewhere. It means that Ukrainians like do want to go into some direction, and the President Zelensky and every leader who is gonna be on his place, he must understand the will of the nation and lead it to that way. If he will go another direction, then like the big riots and etc will start, like the things that we saw during 2013 with Viktor Yanukovych, when he decided to change the direction. Ukrainian nation didn't accept like this choice, and we were ready and willing to fight for our truth and for our wishes. And basically what I would say about the grassroots initiative, that this national idea and spirit flourish since 2014. I would say that most of the initiatives and the volunteering organizations and the charity foundations that we have right now in Ukraine, they somehow related to the revolution of dignity. Basically, what does dignity is? Dignity is a freedom to do what you think is right. And why we are saying that the revolution of 2014 is a revolution of dignity, because Ukrainians understood that they have this freedom, and it was the Maidan time, which I remember very good. It was a time where personal agency started to be a big deal. Basically, we understand ourselves as an agent that can create the change, and this perception and understanding remained even after the Maidan revolution. And basically it was also a big part of Ukrainian resistance, of success of Ukrainian resistance, because we had already the experience of feeling that small deeds are matter. During Maidan, a lot of like young people, students, and as well as me, I also was a student during Maidan. It was the first time in our life when we start collaborating with each other in like such different activities. Right now, there are a lot of research in Ukraine about hierarchy, like when individual agents are acting accordingly and coordinate themselves without any authority or anybody who have any enforcement mechanisms. So basically, this is a free will of free people for coordinating, for doing the common good. And it's all started during Maidan, when the small leaders start grouping around people, and they voluntarily and with their own freedom started doing something for a common good of the Ukrainian nation. And what we are seeing now, like for instance, on this Thursday, we will be making another webinar where we will talk about concrete cases of Ukrainian youth grassroots initiatives which were provoked by war. And I can just now give you some few examples, like there is an initiative, Brave to Rebuild. This is basically 2 or 3 people, 20-year-olds, who are leading like hundreds of volunteers for rebuilding activities in the occupied territories. And it is just a common, I don't know, common way to spend your weekends, to go to the occupied territory and help it to rebuild. Like in Kiev, you know that around Kiev we have a lot of destroyed cities like Irpin, Voronka, Hostomel, etc., etc. So basically, this is absolutely common for now for Ukrainian youth to go to the bus that are organized also voluntarily, just by donating money for people who are doing that. Go to one of the cities and spend your weekends helping people who suffered to rebuild these houses. As well, there is also like one branch of their activity is Brave Bicycles. In the occupied territories, especially in like far territories like Kherson region, Kharkiv region, etc., when Russian troops left the cities, there still like have a lack of basic infrastructure, including the transportation. There is no public buses, there is like not that many cars, and people need to somehow commute around their districts. So basically what Brave to Rebuild do, they are collecting bicycles from people from Ukraine and Europe, and just transfer these bicycles to the occupied territories and donating it to people who just need a ways to commute around the districts, because there is no basic infrastructure for doing that. Or maybe also another good example would be the TUT. TUT is basically the hub, the youth hub for youth in Mykolaiv. That you know that Mykolaiv was really in the beginning of the war, it wasn't captured, but it was a really tough place, because after Kherson they went to Mykolaiv, and they basically were on the border of Mykolaiv, and it experienced severe damage, and especially of civilian infrastructure like schools, kindergartens, etc. And basically what this TUT initiative, and this is initiative by 16-year-olds. So basically it's only people 16-year-olds from Mykolaiv, they are rebuilding the youth hub for themselves, and they are collecting money, they're doing the fixing stuff, they're paying the staff who will make this fixing, and they are doing for themselves the youth center. Or in Kiev as well, also 20-year-olds are making the rehabilitation center for Ukrainian combatants, because we indeed have the rehabilitation center that are state-owned, and as well in Western countries also offer their support in these cases, but still the demand is not enough. We have around 1 million people who are right now fighting this war, and that means that like no country can fully complete all the demands for rehabilitation of the soldiers. And basically Ukrainian youth on volunteer basis are doing the rehabilitation center right now in Kyiv. One more initiative is like probably you know that a lot of money for this war is donated by Ukrainians. We have a special tax for the war, but instead of that, most of population still donate like most of their salaries for buying ammunition and for buying other stuff that is really needed on the front line, and everybody wants to feel somehow connected to this process and to the victory. And basically one more initiative that is trying to accumulate money for helping the military is Book Forces of Ukraine, which is basically the bookstore where people can bring their books and other people will buy them, and all the funds that will be collected in this way will be sent to the military for buying ammunition and drones for that basically are very, very important thing for our military. Like all of these examples, they did not appear just from the, like, I don't know, from nowhere. Basically, all of them are led by young people who have the sense of purpose, and they are able to show their leadership and to organize other young people around themselves and to create something new, something that is needed right now. And they will keep this feeling of purpose and doing something good even after war. So basically what I'm trying to say that this war is a huge pain and destruction for Ukrainian people, but still after war I believe that Ukrainian nation will be much more healthier because we will have a lot of people who has experience of doing something purposely, voluntarily, who has a much bigger trust to each other, who is much less atomized, and who has the experience of doing something great for the victory of Ukraine. And like this condition afterwards will remain after war. And Ukrainian grassroots leadership will flourish even more than it was after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014.
Wow, thank you very much, Yuri, for all the examples. I think this is what may be surprising for some of the participants, because these are the examples that you do not see on the first page on a newspaper or even in online media. I feel that there is this emphasis on political leaders when we talk about leadership and war, often international organizations, in general leaders from the political level, but we do not talk about the leaders at the middle level. So, you know, experts, influencers, sometimes religious leaders, but also the grassroots level, because this is like the biggest level in terms of how many people are involved, but we do not see such stories. But when we talk about the leadership, these are not, you know, individuals at the political level. These are individuals at the grassroots level, but also movements, right? Because we can see individuals making changes, but also people working together. So communities, sometimes movements, sometimes organizations. So we had some great examples, but we didn't talk about what leadership really is. And maybe we should have started with that, because the topic of today's webinar is leadership in the time of war. And both Joanna and Yuri talked about some leadership roles that different actors took, but what true leadership really is, what it means, what is responsible leadership, especially in the time of war, because we sometimes associate different skills to leaders in the time of peace. But then we talk about different skills when we have war. And since we have experts on responsible leadership, Katarzyna, these are the questions to you. So what is responsible leadership? And did you see true responsible leaders when the invasion started?
Thank you very much. I now feel humbled after all these examples and the discussions about political leadership, because where I come from and where the very concept of responsible leadership academy came from was a recognition of what doesn't work, if you allow me to say that, especially in international organizations and international NGOs. But I wanted to start by saying there's a military term that describes the current situation, and well, it's not a new term, but it describes it perfectly well, which is saying that we live in a VUCA world. And VUCA stands for volatile, unpredictable, complex, and ambiguous. And the thing is, with leadership, leaders are humans, whether they are political leaders, leaders in international organizations, leaders on grassroots levels, they're humans, and human brain is not wired to sustain and respond to prolonged situation of, or continuous situation as we have it now, of volatility, unpredictability, complexity, and ambiguity, because our biological response level to stress is has three components: it's flight, fight or freeze. That's how our genetical response is wired. That's how we survive as humanity. And so we can see, and we have seen in the context of this conflict, but also in the context of even the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass in 2014 and previous wars, we have seen leadership attempts to restore predictability and kind of return to the status quo ante, the situation that we know and we feel comfortable with, because that's our comfort zone. And it's difficult to get out of the comfort zone. And I can only speak from the perspective of international organizations and international NGOs, because this is where I have seen it. But I think one of the responses that actually Joanna described is kind of, we might need them later, so we are not going to disturb the equilibrium of power today, because it might hurt us tomorrow. And it's a little bit like, let's try to pretend that it's business as usual type of response. Another one is reactive response rather than proactive anticipation of what might be and being prepared for that. And I have seen this in the OSCE. We are reacting to events that have happened rather than having drawn scenarios of what might emerge and being prepared on how to react in these scenarios. Another one is, and that is also something that I think, Yuri, you have actually listed all the elements of responsible leadership that we have kind of crafted it in our mind. But the things that I have seen happen often is when a war starts or when a crisis starts, is people resort to command and control to the point of micromanagement, because that's what they think strong leadership means. Or they spend a lot of time and effort on things that are very visible and very impactful, but they have no control over them. So putting organizational effort, especially into those things, is really wasting everybody's human potential. And my kind of general thinking is that what leaders really need in times of crisis, such as very complex and very dynamic and very moving targets reality in which they live, they don't need predefined response plans. What they need is a mindset and skills and behaviors that will prevent them from ignoring the reality or overacting, overreacting to yesterday's development, but enable them to move together towards a future purpose. And that's when I say that Yuri actually said everything that we define as responsible leadership in times of crisis, it's because he did. Because what we have defined 6 conditions of responsible leadership in times of crisis. And the first one is ethical decisions and actions. Because, as Yuri said, people in a world of very complex, unpredictable, volatile situations, they need to trust their leaders, and they need leaders they can trust. And these can be political leaders at the national level, but this can also be leaders among us. So we need to trust each other. And that's kind of the first condition. And that also comes with being with certain level of self-awareness and being aware of the fact that we have our own ego, and the higher we are in the leadership on the leadership ladder, the bigger this ego, the more inflated this ego tends to become. But making sure that our self-interest never takes precedent over the interest and protection of people that we are supposed to lead. And also choosing courage over comfort. I do recall, and my son told me today that we need to remember the reaction to the offer to evacuate President Zelensky. And that's exactly living, staying true to your values, but choosing courage over comfort. And it also means accountability. So taking responsibility for your own decisions and actions, but also being able to acknowledge and admit when you are wrong as a leader, and take corrective action. And last thing I want to say, and this is why we need more women leaders or more visibility for women leaders in a situation of conflict. A very important aspect of kind of ethical decisions and actions is being able to admit your own vulnerability as a leader. Nobody is a superhero, nobody is a Superman of all conflicts. And in this war also, it is important to acknowledge that if you are a leader, whether at the national level, which President Zelensky does very well, or locally, you are also prone to hurt, to pain, to making mistakes, to misstepping. And this is your vulnerability that you need to be able to show, because it opens doors to others to feel vulnerable, understand that it's okay, and keep moving nonetheless. And that, I think, is what's important in this context. Then the second thing that we define, that's again what Yuri described, what we defined as a precondition for responsible leadership in times of crisis is engaged and empowered people. No one can be a leader in a situation like this alone. There is no lone wolves. And if we are to bring a resolution to this situation, well, first survive through the war, but also bring a resolution to the situation that is positive, then we need to do it together. And that for leaders means that they have to be there for their people, which President Zelensky did very well. But it also means that we need to show concern. We need to show that we care for the people that we are supposed to lead, and distributing this leadership. It's not about one person saying, this is what we are going to do. It's about all the leaders at all levels being able to make decisions and take action without waiting for green light. I have seen this actually in Central Asia, that the decision-making kind of chain of, the decision-making and the chain of command come into contradiction with one another, because the chain of command is so strong that no one at lower levels will take a decision without getting a green light from above. But in a situation of war, this is impossible. So you have to empower your people to be able to make decisions and take action as the situation develops. And the sense of community and belonging that Yuri was talking about, it's really indispensable. People have to be there for each other and hold each other. One thing that I think we could look at more in the context of Ukraine and the war is diversity, equality, and inclusion. And I'm saying this not only in the context of what happens in Ukraine, but in the context of what happens in Poland, because the paramount paradigm here is leaving no one behind. So those who are most affected by the conflict should be the priority for any response. And yet we have seen situations in which those who are traditionally marginalized, so for example, the Roma people and the people of color who are running away from the conflict, did not receive the same protection, the same rights, the same response at the border as kind of your standard Ukrainian refugee, which is something to look at. And I also think, I mean, in general, I think that the war in Ukraine is a massive lesson of leadership for not only in Ukraine, as Yuri said, but for everybody else. And we should recognize that this is a learning curve for us. In diversity, equality, and inclusion, I also wanted to say that a space and power and voice for women leadership, especially at the national level, is of paramount importance. It's women leadership in the times of conflict that can really make it transformative. And I think this is also something where there could be a little bit of learning in this war. But it also means that we need to let diverse voices to the table and listen to them, because it's our collective wisdom that can get us through this very trying time. Then we talk about responsible communication, and that's again what Yuri was talking about. And here I would say there are these terms in leadership that are, I think, very important. And one of them is active listening, because communication in times of war is a two-way street. Communication in times of crisis in general, it's not just the leader communicating messages of what is called bound optimism. So acknowledging the reality, but also giving people hope. That is important, but it's also important that the message in the other direction can also be transmitted and heard and taken into account. And also its leadership role then to offer what is called informed interpretation. So in a situation of information vacuum or information chaos, or information manipulation, it's the leader's role to tell people what is this that they are seeing, hearing, and how to make sense of the situation. And then the sustainable purpose that Yuri was talking about. We talk a lot about leadership vision, but I think in times of war and in times of a crisis, vision is not enough. Vision is a little bit like this, offering people this pink unicorns. You know, if we hold together and if we walk together, we will reach this bright future. But it's not about that. It's about creating a shared purpose. It's about creating a sense that when working together, people can bring about change to the predicament they are in today. And it's not necessarily a vision of a bright future. It's a vision of a changed reality that does no more harm to people. And then the last thing they wanted to say, but it's just a small thing, it's about what we call responsible innovation. And here in the context of Ukraine and the war, and this is also what I said about international response to the war, it's about creating safe space for iterative learning. In other words, learning to fail and growing from it. And I think we see international organizations that are taking what they have done over the past year in Ukraine as a learning and learning together with their local partners in Ukraine, for example, about the principles of responsible partnership. And that is a very important aspect of it, not only to respond, but also to make sure that we are taking this opportunity, looking at the amazing frontline response in Poland, in Romania, in Ukraine, and learn what leadership, grassroots, on-the-ground leadership should really teach us about the principles of responsible leadership.
Katarzyna, when I was listening to you, I felt that what we are discussing here is not just relevant to the current war in Europe, but is relevant to the discussions about the future of nations and the world in general, about leadership in general. A few years back, when President Trump was the US president, there was this discussion about what true leadership was, and should we think just about ourselves and be self-obsessed, or should we still work with others, and do we need others? And I feel that our discussion about the war in Europe is also relevant to the discussions about the future of cooperation of people, nations, organizations. And I'm really happy that today we have 3-to-1 women to men, because you mentioned female representatives, and I often see that when we have discussions about leadership, these are just men in the discussions talking about what leadership is. And I feel that, you know, the half of the world is missed in such discussions. But these are not just men and women, but also other groups, people with different identities that are not included in the conversations. So you mentioned inclusion. These are minority groups. But often when we look at the, you know, negotiation table or like the main decision-making table, these are the same people with a certain gender, with often certain age or the age, you know, limit, but not all people are included. And the same with the discussions about the current war. When we look in the television, when we look at the experts talking about the war, we see that often the discussions are in one bubble and the rest of the country, the rest of the world is excluded. But I want to keep one thought going about being together and working together. Because this is something I feel that the current wave of the war showed us all that no one can deal with any hard situation alone. A person, a country, organization, no matter if you are the US or Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, right? If you're alone, you are not able to respond to the problems that are, you know, on your way. Climate crisis, terrorism, migration, war. This is not something that you can deal with alone. So I will want to come back to Joanna and ask a question about working together and being together, because the UN is still the biggest and the most powerful organization in the world. This is a wonderful platform for people, nations to work together, to be together, to make decisions together. So can the UN keep its position as the global leader? The current war, it's a really hard test, and some people, experts, are saying that the UN just failed. But as you mentioned, there are some leaders with initiatives using sometimes the procedures, sometimes, you know, innovation, to show that this is not a body that is dead, that we can still do something with what we have. So what kind of a leader should it be, the UN, and who will be the leaders, actors changing the UN, who can potentially take the lead?
Well, UN is a lot of different things, because you have the member states and you also have the leaders of the secretariat who, to bigger or lesser extent, show leadership. But in terms of what's happening in the context of the war and other conflicts that should be dealt with by the Security Council, and the Security Council is failing to do so, what we see are very smart, experienced, usually quite young ambassadors, and both women and men, who begin to think what could be done, and they start kind of incubating some ideas and look for potential allies. And usually the way a particular idea works is that there is some or a couple of ambassadors who come up with an idea, and then they look around who is likely to be supporting. And then they reach out to different groups of members to get their understanding and possibly support for an initiative. Usually At the UN, these things don't happen overnight. It takes usually months, sometimes more than that. But for instance, one of the most recent initiative that was successful and led to creating of a new mechanism was less than a month ago. The General Assembly again decided to create an institution within the UN which would help Syrians who are missing or trying to find their loved ones, regardless from what side of the conflict, what area of Syria, that there will be a mechanism that will be helping to trace what happened to those loved ones. And this isn't a small thing. And initially, it seemed quite controversial, but the core group, which precisely had the ambassador of Luxembourg, it had the woman ambassador of Costa Rica, they would meet with smaller groups of diplomats and just telling them how incredibly important it is for families to have some sort of a closure or to have some hope that they will know one day what happened. So I think what is needed, not everybody can do everything, but if you have several individuals who are above average in terms of their creativity, their courage, and also their commitment to a particular cause. And the commitment sometimes means that you have to do a lot of footwork and not everything is terribly exciting, but you just do it. There is a chance of success. And from watching the Security Council was something that I always watched most closely, but now I see the General Assembly as potentially much more hopeful. The General Assembly was deeply asleep for about 4 decades since the end of the Cold War, but it's now waking up. And possibly the center of political gravity in the UN, within the UN, can move at least on some issues from the Security Council towards the General Assembly. And there is no veto in the General Assembly, and every member of the UN is a permanent member of the General Assembly. So there aren't some of the limitations that are very serious in the Security Council don't exist in General Assembly.
So again, working together, young ambassadors coming together and bringing, some ideas and having an initiative. Is it the same with people working at the grassroots level? Yuri, I'm just wondering, because you can see, Joanna just mentioned that there are sometimes individuals who see that something is not working and they're trying to figure out, okay, so this is not working, so how we can do something knowing that this part is not working, but maybe there are some other mechanisms, other things that we can use, we can bypass, and still make important decisions. Is it the same with people at the grassroots level, but not just in Ukraine? I'm just wondering if the same can happen in Russia, because when we think about the current war, it's not just Ukraine, right? Ukraine is being attacked by Russia. So what about the Russian citizens? What about grassroots level initiatives in Russia? Do you think that a change can come from below? Again, when we think about a possible change, we often focus on political leaders, so the Russian president or people close to him. But there are also some activists working in Russia to stop the war. There are some protests. The scale is not huge, but it's there. So do you think it's possible for the change to come from below? we can see that Ukrainian society is very active. Can we expect an awakening in Russia and potentially also in Belarus, because it started in 2020 after the presidential elections? It was a huge movement, nonviolent movement there. It's, you can say, asleep now, but it's not over. So how do you assess that? Do you see this potential that a change can come from below?
Well, me personally, I believe that the social transformation and change of culture and mindset only possible from the lower level, from the grassroots level. But there is problems and issues, in particular with Russia and with Belarus as well. The power of change is coming from the grassroots level, but still, the individual agents still exist in a structure of society, hierarchy of different life chances and different resource distribution. So basically, this structure is pushing the transformation from grassroots level down. And this is exactly what we observe in many post-Soviet countries, and as well as in Russia and Belarus, because all the individual initiative that trying to flourish, it's immediately pushed down by the authority. If you're talking about Ukraine, we have a really strong civil society, but it's not something that is should be taken for granted, because we have a big history of fighting for that set right, for being a proactive society. It wasn't that like when I was born. It wasn't that like when we were in Soviet Union. So basically, our civil society went through a lot of different historical struggles to prove the right to be proactive and to prove the right for grassroots initiatives to take lead, and so that the political leadership is following the civic society, not the opposite. And what we see in Russia right now, and like my personal opinion, that if we will just after the war let Russia to transform itself by itself, it won't happen, because we saw it like in the history for many times. Because of this culturally conditioned centralization of resources, executive powers, etc., the Russian political leadership has a lot of mechanisms, enforcement mechanism to suppress this grassroots leadership and grassroots initiatives and responsible leadership that Katarzyna was talking about. What we as Ukraine and as the Western countries can do in this way, like from my personal point of view, we need to, after war, to take from Russia part of its sovereignty. Take part of its sovereignty, just not to give them another opportunity again to suppress all grassroots movements and again to create a dictator. Why do we need that? Because for sure we need Russia to be decentralized in terms of financial distribution of resources, decentralized in terms of executive powers, decentralized in terms of creating strong civil society in its communities. And it won't happen if we will just leave Russia as it is. Because indeed there have a lot of movements that are trying to emerge, but still, if the structure of the state will remain the same, completely centralized, the huge country, huge resources, it still will have enough power to reburn another dictatorship in future. If we want to create a better world, a better society, for some times, some parts of sovereignty of Russian Federation must be taken, and we are the one who needs to take the responsibility for this process, because it won't happen by itself. So basically, yes, I believe that transformation should go from a grassroots, but what Russia needs, we must suppress its power to let these grassroots initiatives and responsible leadership flourish. And only after that, the true transformation of Russian Federation can emerge.
Yuri, what you just said was very controversial, I believe, for at least many of our participants. But thank you very much for sharing this.
That's why I emphasize that it is my personal opinion, not even
sure.
the opinion of the academy. It's only my personal views, and I'm trying to make a discussion out of that.
Yeah, I think that it's really important to think ahead and think about the future. When we think about the possible end of the war, it's not just about this moment when it ends, but also what we should do, what is the next step, right? For example, if we signed a peace agreement, what is, what we do on the next day and the next days and the next months and years, because that's not the end of the conflict. As we know, from the theory of conflict transformation, you can say that signing a peace agreement is often just at the beginning of a very hard road, because rebuilding, it's not just rebuilding the buildings, it's rebuilding societies, it's rebuilding relationships. For example, the relationship between Ukrainian people and Russian people and the European people, right? So it's a huge process. So I'm very happy that you mentioned this issue, because I feel that even right now, when the war is ongoing, we should be thinking about the next steps, and we should think strategically and in a long perspective, not just about how to end what is currently happening, but what to do next, how to prevent the next war from happening, how to make strong societies, because what you all are emphasizing is that strong societies are key to a peaceful world. Because if we have strong societies, citizens at the grassroots level eager to make initiatives full of knowledge, also knowing what violence is, then this is how we can prevent the war. So thank you very much for starting this conversation about the future. I want us to have a few minutes at the end to for the questions that we have from the audience. But one more question to Katarzyna, and this is a very hard and easy question the same way. Who will be the leaders of tomorrow? Organizations, human beings, who will be the leaders? And I know that the answer can be, broad. We can write a doctorate dissertation on that, or it can be very simple. But if you can give us your answer to these questions, the leaders of tomorrow, how do you see it?
That is an excellent question, like no pressure question. I think it depends, because I do think, we have a slogan that we live by, which is that organizations do not bring change, only people do. And that is why I subscribe by under what Yuri said, that the change will come from the bottom up. Because that's how it should be. And still, I think in a world in which we live, who will be the leaders of the future? I think there are different scenarios here. And it kind of depends where the world will progress and which world order will prevail. If the multilateral principles built after the Second World War remain intact and transform internally to really be leaders of positive change, whether for this peace process when it starts or in climate disaster or in any other challenges that we globally together face, then there is a chance that there will be leadership in the UN, collective leadership in the UN, in the OSCE, and in other multilateral organizations of this world. But if the bipolar world to which we are unfortunately heading takes precedence, then we will have political leadership that will not be driven by what people want, but by where power is and where resources are, and that's a different type of leadership. And that's not necessarily the leadership that I personally would prefer. I also think that the leadership of the people, so to speak, is only possible when the positive peace, so the not only absence of war, but the presence of protection of rights, democracy, and all other conditions for positive peace, where these conditions are met. And so while I do, and I think we should think about it today, I was actually thinking and discussing this at PATRIR, nomen omen, that if any future peace process in Ukraine needs to, of course, be complete of reconciliation efforts, and reconciliation also has to happen at the community level, because it's not only the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, but it is also the relationship between Russians and Ukrainians within Ukraine that could be a make or break of sustainability of any peace process in the future. So whether we have community leaders who are, and whether we can now build community leaders able of driving a reconciliation process that will be inclusive of everybody is, I think, a very important question, but we will need community leaders able of driving reconciliation process inclusive of everybody. I would like to believe that in more global terms, that the people like Yuri described, that the Greta Thunbergs of this world could be the leaders of tomorrow and could really drive an agenda of change that will not treat them as mascots, excuse this expression, but will actually listen to what they say and make change because of the truth in what they say and the power of the argument. That's what I would like to believe. That's what I am very committed to see happen. Whether this will happen, again, speaking of bounded optimism, we have too many powers at stake and too many powers at play and too many things at stake to believe that people can now take things into their own hands and make transformation happen, whether in Ukraine or on any critical issue. So I think we need political leadership, but we need political leadership that is different than the one today. Not the one that is all about power and remaining in power and controlling, and also compromising where it is compromising out of convenience and not out of a bigger purpose. But we need leadership that's truly committed to the people. As trivial as it might sound, whether we have such leaders, it is difficult to say. I was actually thinking about this in the context of the OSCE, which has its own issues simply because it is based on a consensus principle. But I was thinking that, in fact, because of its rotational chairpersonship that is currently held by a small but not insignificant country of North Macedonia, that has the war in Ukraine, nth year with no budget adopted for the entire organization, and the reappointment of all 4 key posts of the organization coming up. And yet it handles this whole situation and drives the organization forward and initiates critical discussions for the change within the organization. That your typical leadership of, the United States, China, and Russia as kind of powerful and intimidating as they might be, might not necessarily be the change that will happen tomorrow.
This is the answer to my question. Thank you very much. Not bad for such a question, I think. Thanks a lot for giving us this perspective answer, but also with some questions included, right? For us to think about. We have 2 questions, one in the chat and a few minutes left. So I will read you the questions, and who is happy to answer, then he or she will answer. So the first question in our chat from Eli McCarthy: I've heard of trauma mitigation efforts for civil society in Ukraine. Is anyone doing this for political leaders so they can be less influenced by trauma in their decision making? This is the first question. And the second question is reform of the international organizations like OSCE and the UN, or new organization with better mechanisms? So this is the second question. We have 2 questions. Who wants to? Maybe we can start with the first one. So is there anything for political leaders going on, or in plans? Because yes, they are also, they can be traumatized. They are influenced by the current situation. The level of stress, cortisol is high. So what about them? Do you know about such initiatives, or you maybe have some comments on that? Who wants to jump in? Yuri.
Well, personally, I haven't heard about such kind of initiatives. Although when I heard this question, I thought, like, my first thought was like, that could be great. That could be great initiative, basically, in the or any kind of project, etc., etc. But what I observe from our national leadership right now is that, like, the trauma didn't end it yet. If you're talking about the, like, post-traumatic disorders or other things that are emerge after traumatic experience, so we're still in the process of this experience. So I'm not sure if right now is the right time to work with some, I don't know, psychological related issues when the cortisol levels are that high, and they need to be that high in order to keep them, I don't know, alive. Like me personally, since the war began, I also changed my perception of weekends, and I know that, like, I don't have them anymore, because every weekend I am, like, trying to do something in order to make the victory closer, and as well as many Ukrainians do. And as my first education is psychology, I understand the consequences of such actions and perceptions. But, like, as a person, I understand that right now I cannot do, like, another. I can do only in this way, because we're still in this experience. But afterwards, maybe after the Ukrainian victory, there will be a big demand for psychologists who will work with different, numerous kinds of people, because everybody is traumatized, not only the political leaders. But the question is great in terms that it just made me think about that the political leaders indeed gonna need some specific treatment, I don't know, psychological.
Thank you very much, Yuri, also for sharing your own experience. I think it's a great value when we don't just talk about others, but we're also sharing our own experiences. I know it's not always easy, so thank you very much for sharing your own story and your own experiences. Katarzyna.
I wanted to say that I do fully appreciate, and I don't feel even closely empowered to comment on what you said, Yuri. I wanted to say something a little bit to the contrary, however. I work a lot with the leadership of national human rights institutions across Europe. And some of them are really in immensely difficult, prolonged, difficult stress situation. And what I tell them, and that the way we work through kind of leadership is the very principle that we always hear when we fly: put your own mask first before assisting others. Because a human being has a limited capacity to cope. And if it runs out, then we are becoming useless for ourselves. But first of all, useless as leaders. We cannot go on adrenaline alone forever. And so this stop moment to reflect, to acknowledge, to allow ourselves be vulnerable for a while so that we can emerge stronger, and then go on to in our leadership capacities is tremendously important. And I think this is a really good question, by the way.
It's 4:30, so we should finish, but we have this one more question. So maybe a quick answer, if we can try to find out a good quick answer to such a complicated and really difficult question. Reform of the international organizations, or a new organization with better mechanisms. Joanna, maybe you want to take this one. You're muted.
Okay, finally. Sorry for the delay. I think you asked the question about different types of organizations. I would stay with the one organization that has all the members, or members from all over the world. And I think an organization of this type is necessary in the globalized world, in the world with climate change. There are many problems that need to be addressed by something that has a global jurisdiction and not regional or some other organizing principle. Undertaking a reform, I think, is a little bit of a waste of time. Just to give you an example, there has been a kind of a process discussing the reform of the Security Council, which a few months ago celebrated 30 years of its existence. And meanwhile, nothing has moved forward and probably will not. There is now a wave of some noises about the Security Council reform being necessary, and it is necessary, but I very much don't think it will happen in any foreseeable future. But I think starting to act like leaders, like people who can change something, is one way of reforming. And I think there is something going on that is reforming the the General Assembly, because the General Assembly is now, in some cases, not hiding behind the Security Council, not waiting for the Security Council, but there is some leader and then a leadership group behind an initiative, and some of these initiatives are successful. And I think the Security Council could also, probably its members could be a little bit more adventurous and proactive. Some of them are, but not all of them, and some of them are extremely intimidated by the permanent members, and that's a huge mistake. And if you look at things that have succeeded in the last, let's say, 15 years, some of them were entirely done by the initiatives, because obviously the permanent members had to agree to it and not block it, but the work has been done by elected members. And I think this is the way to perhaps save the multilateral system. I think creating a new worldwide organization would take a very long time, and I'm not sure it could be done. And we need something that applies to everybody.
We need a platform where we can all work together. Joanna, Katarzyna, Yuri, it was a huge pleasure for me to be here with you to ask you questions. It's been 1.5 hours, and I feel that, you know, I can spend another 1.5 hours or even 3 hours talking to you. There are so many aspects that you mentioned that can be topics of our next conversations, discussions, and meetings. Thank you very much for finding time to be here with us. It's the summertime, but you said yes to my questions when I asked you about participation. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your participation and the amazing thoughts that you were sharing with us. I want to thank our participants for being with us. Sorry that, you know, it's 5 minutes past the time that we should have finished our conversation, but it was really hard. It was really hard to finish. Again, thank you very much. I look forward to our next conversations because I feel that this discussion is not over. And I hope that we will continue talking and not just talking, but also changing our discussions into actions so that we can see a real transformation of the current conflict and positive peace building in Europe and in the world. Have a great afternoon. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon.